I did 24 years with the FBI before I came to Virginia Tech. And I was talking to somebody here today who asked me why I'm at Virginia Tech, and I will tell you quite frankly, the main reason I'm at Virginia Tech is because of the tragedy there on April 16th of 2007. I went to Virginia Tech that day in my FBI role as a supervisor out of the Roanoke office of the FBI, which is, as a crow flies, about 20, 30 miles north of Blacksburg. And I will tell you, not only the professional law enforcement response that I saw that day, but also the way that community pulled together and essentially told the rest of the world, you will not define Virginia Tech by this tragedy. You do not have that privilege, all you folks on the outside. Only those of us here on this campus have that right to define what we are going to be. And they took back that campus, and here we are today. I said, when I have a chance to retire from my federal side, I want to be a part of Virginia Tech, and I want to be a part of the Virginia Tech Police Department. So I called the chief at the time when I turned 50. In the Bureau, you can retire at 50. I called the chief at the time, Wendell Flensham, good friend of mine, and I said, Wendell, I can retire. Any consideration you might give me to bring me down there, I would be most happy. He called me 2 days later and said, were you serious about that? And I said, yes, I was very serious about that. And so 2 weeks later, I had an interview with Sherwood, and fortunately, they brought me on board, fortunately for me, and I retired 2 weeks after that, and so I've been there ever since, and it's because of that community. But long before there was Columbine, long before there was Virginia Tech, long before we had the shootings at Northern Illinois as well, we've had school violence in this country for years and years and years. In fact, one of the first episodes on recorded history happened back in May of 1927. Andrew Kehoe was angry over the fact that his school taxes had been raised. And so he wanted to do something about that. So he actually went to the point of getting a job with the school district as a custodian. And he was working in the school. And while he was working in the school, he brought a bunch of explosive devices into the school and planted them in various places. And then one day he went out to his car and somehow set them off, and they all blew up, and you can see what happened. When they searched his property outside of town, they found this handmade sign on his fence. Criminals are made, not born, which is a very interesting phrase, if you will. So it's been around for a long time. Back in March of 2018, I had the distinct honor and privilege of being invited to the White House to meet with President Trump, meet with Vice President Pence, and many others after the tragedy at Parkland, Florida. And we talked about a lot of different things. We talked about what we could all do together about this scourge of school violence in the United States. And one of the things that I brought to the table that I talked about that day with all those folks was threat assessment. And so essentially, threat assessment is nothing new. It's not terribly difficult. It's not a science, if you will. It's something that we look at pretty easily. 4 steps that we are really interested in finding out if a person poses a threat. First of all, do they have an idea about carrying out an act? So do we have ideation? Have they been planning? Have they gotten to that part where now not only are they thinking about it, but they're planning? The third step in the process is acquisition. Are they starting to gather the materials necessary to carry out their attack? And then, of course, the fourth, implementation, the actual carrying out of the attack. So in threat assessment, what we try to do is we want to stop them in this process as soon as possible. Obviously, we'd like to do that with when they start thinking about it. That's when we would love to have somebody pick up the phone and give us a call and saying, hey, there's something going on with my friend. He's talking about this or she's talking about that. And then the threat assessment team can get involved and maybe do something about it. When they get to the planning stage, if they involve others, that's when you hope you start getting the calls. Of course, acquisition, if they're starting to buy things, if they're starting to buy weapons, if they're starting to gather the things they need to carry out their attack, you don't have a whole lot of time at that point. And that's when you really hope somebody's picking up the phone and calling to let us know what's going on so we can maybe head it off at that point. So what is threat assessment? Again, we try to keep it as simple as possible. I'm not a very smart person, so I need things as simple as possible. So we try to keep it very simple. We simply want to identify, investigate, assess, and then manage if necessary. Manage the situation, manage that person, their behavior and so forth. So that's the key. How do we manage? This is our mission statement at Virginia Tech, our threat assessment team. Surprisingly enough, you may be surprised to learn that prior to the shootings there in 2007, Virginia Tech was actually in the process of setting up a threat assessment team, a threat assessment process. And they brought in an expert. His name is Gene Dysinger, and some of you may know Gene. Virginia Tech ended up recruiting Gene because he was deputy chief at Illinois State, I believe it was. Yeah, one of the schools, or Iowa, one of the schools in Iowa, before he came to Virginia Tech. So Virginia Tech brought him on as deputy chief of police at Virginia Tech, as well as our director of threat management. And Gene, who is one of this nation's leading experts in threat management, set up the process, perfected it. And so we were very happy for that. You know, Gene's a PhD psychologist as well as a law enforcement officer, and we used to tease him. We used to say, you know, he's your worst nightmare. He's a shrink with a gun and a badge. So, but when he arrests you, he asks you afterwards, how did it feel to be arrested? So it's all good. But after the attack at Virginia Tech, Virginia changed their law and made it a requirement under the law that all public institutions of higher education have some type of threat assessment process. A few years ago, they amended that law to require all schools, K through 12 in Virginia, to have that threat assessment process. So we were really lucky that we had gotten out ahead of that curve at Virginia Tech, and we had Gene setting up that process for us. This is our team composition, all right? And this is done intentionally, because if you look at the different areas that are represented on this screen, what we try to do is we try to bring people together who have resources available to them in all their walks of life on campus that we can bring to bear on any case that we're looking at Virginia Tech. So, for example, the director of Cook Counseling Center, our mental health counseling center at Virginia Tech, he's got a whole range of tools he can bring to the table to help us in this threat assessment process, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. All right, we don't want to add a whole lot of stuff into it. We already know we have the resources necessary to handle these cases in-house on campus. It's just a matter of figuring out where does this case best go. And so we intentionally chose these positions that are all appointed by our president, and that's who is currently on our threat assessment team. We meet weekly, every Tuesday morning, and we talk about cases. I wish I could say that our meetings were very short, but a lot of times they're a couple of hours long, but it's okay, because that's what we're there to do. Some places have separate threat assessment teams. Some places call them behavioral intervention teams. Whatever you call it, doesn't matter. And when I say separate teams, some universities will have one just for students and one for staff and faculty. We just see the benefit of having one for the entire campus. So that's the way we do it at Virginia Tech. These are the general principles that we go through when we talk about threat assessment, and I'm not going to bore you by going through each one of these one by one. I just want to point out a few things up here. Number one, prevention is possible. It is definitely possible that we can prevent these attacks. A lot of times, as I mentioned, they're thought out well in advance. How many times do we hear about a shooting in the United States when afterwards they go out and they talk to the neighbors, they talk to colleagues, they talk to fellow students, and they say, well, gee, he was such a great person. I never thought he was capable of doing something like this. Or, yeah, I knew he was a bit depressed, but wow, I never thought. There are so many things out there that if we can have one central place where we can get this information together, we might be able to prevent it. So prevention is definitely possible. Targeted violence is the product of an interaction amongst four factors, and you can see those factors there. The one I want to point out is environment, because some people ask me about that. What do you mean by that? I'm not talking about an environment that facilitates or permits violence or does not discourage it. What I mean by environment is, what is that person's environment? Where do they live? What community are they in? Who are their friends? Who are their associates? And that community, those groups they belong to, do they espouse violence? Do they talk about violence? Do they tolerate violence? Or do they not? Clearly, at most universities, I would venture to say probably all universities, but especially at Virginia Tech, we do not tolerate violence. And we make that very, very clear in a lot of different ways on campus. So our students, our staff and faculty, our community knows that's the type of thing that will not be tolerated here. And so when we have it, we react very quickly and we react very consistently, which is very important. So folks will learn what's tolerated and what isn't tolerated, okay? Threat assessment is about behavior, not profiles. You cannot profile a threat. And I think the best example of that is 9/11. As Michael mentioned, on 9/11, I became the unit chief of the Osama bin Laden unit at FBI headquarters. That was my first day as chief of that unit at FBI headquarters. But it's about behavior, not profiles. So after 9/11, what happened in this country? We had folks who were being profiled because of their particular religious beliefs or the way they dressed, especially our Sikh friends who are not Muslim, they're Hindu, but they wear headdresses, much like some of our friends in the Arabic world wear headdresses as well. And so we saw a lot of cases after that of people saying, they've got to be a terrorist because they're wearing a headdress. You know, it's about behavior, not profiles, okay? Multiple reporting mechanisms enhance early identification. This is critical. Think about on your own campuses where people can report things. How easily do you make it for people to report things? Can they report to the head of facilities if it's one of those folks that work in facilities? Do they have a mechanism to give information when necessary? And then, Chris Kiewis, does he know where to send that information when he gets it? We try to make that very easy at Virginia Tech. So think about your community, student affairs, Greek life, your disciplinary system, your Title IX people, administration, facilities, faculty. Do all these folks know that they have a place to report things they are concerned about? And if so, do they know how to do it? And once they report it, do the folks who get that information know how to get it into the hands of the threat assessment team? Make that system as easy and foolproof as you possibly can. So again, where to report? Basically at Virginia Tech, we get reports from all over the place. The vast majority of our reporting right now comes from our own department, from the police department, because obviously we are getting reports of crime and those types of behavior in our community. So a lot of that stuff we are getting and sharing with the threat assessment team. But it can come from any one of these places. And all of these places are very, very important to partner with. So the steps in the threat assessment process, pretty simple when you stop to think about it. Again, you want to facilitate reporting to the team, you want to identify people, you want to gather information, and you want to think outside the box. Don't think just inside your little box of threat information comes from the police or emergency management or security. It can come from everywhere. As we have seen today, it can come from everywhere. And so it's important that you gather the information from as many sources as you possibly can, and then take a look at the total picture and put together what you have, understanding that somebody in one department may look at a situation this way, somebody in another department may look at the same situation and decide this is not a threat, based on their own experience. So it's important to gather all that stuff from all those folks and then see where the facts lead you. Monitor and reevaluate the plan to ensure safety, and then refer and follow up as appropriate. Following up is key, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So where do we get the information from? Well, it's pretty simple. These are just some examples of who should be reporting: your coworkers, other staff, friends, family. We educate our community on campus a lot about threat assessment, and we don't just talk about one particular list. We talk about everywhere where this information can come from, anywhere that it can come from. It's important to document it and ensure that you're answering those key investigative questions. The way we do it at Virginia Tech is all of our information is kept within the police department, our record-keeping system. We do that on purpose because the law in Virginia with threat assessment clearly states that those records are not subject to FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. And so when the media asks for our reports, we do not have to turn them over. And that's critical, especially if somebody wants to remain anonymous. We don't want to have to give up those sources. What do we want our folks to report about? This is a slide that we take right from our training program at Virginia Tech. These are just some of the examples that we want to hear about. And we tell our folks that, but we say the most important thing on that slide is at the bottom. This may be nothing but. One of the things we are very, very keen on educating our community is we don't want anybody in our community to ever hesitate to call the police department when there's an issue, no matter how silly they may think they're being or how much they may think they're wasting our time. We take every single thing we get very, very seriously. After all, our community expects us to. That's what we're there to do, is to keep our community safe. And if we're not taking things seriously, then we don't have our community support. We might as well be doing something else. So it's very critical when I train my community to say, this may be nothing but. Never hesitate to call. Because you never know, you may be the second, third, or fourth person calling about a particular person or a particular behavior. Now I see a pattern. Now we have something. So that becomes critical. Just to give you some idea of the cases that we look at Virginia Tech, these are our statistics by calendar year. You can see that they've increased pretty much over the years. Now, having said that, it's very important, because my handsome boss is sitting down front here, to understand this does not necessarily mean Virginia Tech is a dangerous place or is a violent place. No, quite the opposite. Blacksburg, which is the community that surrounds us, was recently ranked the #1 safest city in Virginia by an independent security and safety organization, professional safety organization. Virginia Tech was ranked the 8th safest campus by that same organization. So this by no means, I want you to think that it's a dangerous place. But this just shows how we've educated our community, how our community is so much more willing now to come forward with information to let us take a look at it, okay? So it's not that it's more dangerous. And also look at our students. Some studies suggest that upwards of 25% of students coming to college campuses today are coming with some pre-diagnosed mental health issue, and they're being treated for that mental health issue. And in my personal experience, I will tell you, some of those students that come to our campus for their first year, they, a lot of times, will self-diagnose. After a while, they feel good. I don't need this medicine anymore. I don't have this issue. They stop taking it. Then they go into crisis. Or, believe it or not, they don't know how to take their medication. Right? Mom, dad, whoever it is, handed their pill to them every morning at the same time or every evening at the same time. They never had to think about, I have to take this at 7 a.m. They never think about that because they've never had to do it. So they come to the school and they just simply don't know how to keep those types of schedules. Okay, so that's why we see some of those numbers increasing. We also see some of those numbers increasing because we do much more than we used to do back in the day with threat assessment at Virginia Tech. And you can see some of the things here. One of our policy requirements at Virginia Tech is all potential students, when they apply, they must disclose to us any arrest record they have or any type of experience they've had with law enforcement, no matter what it is. And some of those cases, the admissions people get them, they look at them. If they feel it rises to the level of they want the threat assessment team to take a look at it, they will send us those applications. And so we will review those. Now, it's important to say, we don't have the authority to tell admissions or to tell our HR folks, our hiring folks, you cannot hire that person because we believe they're a threat, or you cannot admit that student because we believe they are a threat. We simply can give advice. But what we tell our folks is, if you get a letter from us saying we have some concerns, that means we have some very serious concerns. And we probably should have some discussions before this person either comes here or this person is hired. We also have a select agent program on campus. We do all of the assessments for people who are going to be working with the dangerous cooties, as I like to call them, the select agents that we have. And then whenever our president or any of our administrators or anybody on campus gets letters and emails and stuff that concerns them, we take a look at that as well. So that's why we're doing more and more and more, okay? So I went over by 7 seconds as well, so I'm gonna stop there because I am between us and happy hour. And so I wanna be happy too. I'll be at happy hour, and if you have any questions or anything that I can answer for you, I'll be happy to do so. So thank you very much.